Welcome everybody to the session. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jennifer McCarroll. I'm the Strategic Programme Manager for Scotland Excel. The focus of the session this afternoon is on the legislative landscape for social care procurement, particularly the light touch regime. So for those of you who work in the area of social care commissioning and procurement, you'll be pretty clear, I think, about the expectation to work more collaboratively with providers, and on the back of that, Scotland Excel, we are certainly seeing more questions about the light touch regime and about the flexibility that it does or doesn't allow. So that was why we were keen to get this session in as part of the conference today. To lead the session, we are very fortunate to have with us Robin Fallis from McRoberts. Robin's one of the firm's partners, and his area of expertise includes advising public bodies and those who interface with public bodies on contractual matters and legislative concerns. Robin is a member of the Law Society of Scotland's Charity Sub-Law Committee. It's a bit of a wordy one, and he works closely with the third sector. Since 2011, Robin's been heavily involved alongside Ready for Business in the Scottish Government's Developing Markets programme, with a particular focus on developing new and innovative ways in which the public sector can work together with the third sector. So I think it ties in quite nicely with some of the conversations that we're having wider in social care at the moment. Many of you might well have come across Robin before. He's been doing bits and pieces of work in this area for a while, and he has been leading on some of the training the Scottish Government commissioned back when we had our most recent set of procurement regulations. So the agenda for the session is that Robin will give us a brief presentation and overview, and then we will welcome questions. I have got some quick housekeeping things just to run through with you, if I may. Apologies if you've heard this before, but so we have some people joining some sessions and not others, so I'll just quickly run through that. So all attendees' microphones have been muted to avoid echoes. Due to the number of attendees, we request that you keep your camera turned off. This is due to bandwidth restrictions, and it helps us keep the session running smoothly. The session will be recorded and will be made available on the Academy after the conference. That includes the presentation that Robin will give us and the Q&A session afterwards. So I will now invite Robin to kick off. Robin, if that's okay, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll come back in with the Q&A at the end. If you've got questions, folks, at the end, I'll ask you to raise your hand. It would be helpful if you could ask Robin directly, but if you want to, you can put them in the chat box, and we'll keep an eye on them, and I'll ask Robin them on your behalf at the end. So thanks, Robin.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the graveyard slot of a lawyer speaking about procurement law immediately after lunch on a Friday afternoon. Fortunately, I hope I've sorted things in the background. I got rid of the family, so we shouldn't have any background noise. The good thing is we're talking about the light touch regime and its use in the context of social care, which I actually find is a very interesting and important area of procurement at the moment. One thing before I start, I've opted for no slides for my presentation, but please be assured you'll get a recording, transcript, and a few helpful follow-up slides by way of follow-up. I say this because I do take a run through some of the light touch regime regulations. Bottom line is that for you can sit back safe in the knowledge that you don't need to take a note, and hopefully that will generate some discussion for the latter part of the session. So I anticipate that many of you have experience of the light touch regime in a variety of ways. There's a pretty significant variation in usage at the moment across Scotland for a variety of reasons. In some areas, it's the particular focus of a service that may influence how the procurement goes ahead. Sometimes it's past experiences of a contracting authority which determine their approach. Some have had their fingers burnt, sometimes they're heavily lobbied, sometimes they have staff who understand things better, sometimes they have more capacity. A big factor is often the appetite of legal, finance, procurement and departments within contracting authorities to consider and implement new approaches, which we'll come back to. I'd like to start by making three brief high-level observations about the light touch regime, and then what we'll come on to talk about. The first is, from 2004 through to 2012, many procurement lawyers and specialists were inadvertently scaring the living daylights out of contracting authorities by updating them on ever-increasing procurement requirements, aspects of case law. A consequence of this was to push public bodies into more formulaic processes, driven by a fear that anything other than a standard process was introducing risk, or put another way, a view developed that there was safety in the process, or least risk in doing what was done last time. Bit of a sea change since 2005 or so. I found myself, 2015, telling authorities that it's useful to think in terms of the crest of the procurement risk wave having passed, and we as lawyers see that borne out in the Scottish courts a little bit. And we'll see what the UK government does pursuant to its Green Paper as to whether that is likely to be a permanent change in direction. So focus recently in many ways in Scotland has been on in using the existing tools, and light touch regime is part of that, within procurement law that provide flexibility, and looking at how we can use that flexibility to make procurement more effective. And we see this not only in social care, but in areas such as, and these will be familiar, community benefits, fair work, SMEs, social enterprise engagement, carbon and sustainability. If you take this de-risking theme, it's interesting that I think it still stands despite the old social care Part B approach pre-2016, which didn't require a contract notice, being rebadged as the light touch regime and bringing in the requirement for the contract notice. At the time, back in 2016, some thought that might up-risk social care procurement. But in many ways, the contract notice that now front ends these social care procurements is often your friend, and we'll come back to that. So drawing this in for the first theme, in the social care area, my constant refrain has been, don't procure social care like you procure widgets. Use the considerable flexibility that is there. And so theme one is the light touch regime is flexible. Use that flexibility and do it confidently, because if anything, there's less risk in the light touch area and social care than under the core processes. Second theme is that in the area of social care procurement risk sits alongside a number of other areas of risk. Quite often it's the significant budgetary risk, and you'll have finance people saying, hold on, we want to say in how this procurement goes ahead. And another important area is in around other sectoral bits of legislation. So self-directed support legislation and or social work legislation. And we increasingly see examples of authorities proceeding in one way and then somebody jumping in and challenging not just the procurement aspect, but the compliance with these other aspects. So theme two is use the flexibility of the light touch regime also to reduce non-procurement risks, making sure that you comply with these other aspects in what you do. The third theme is really a practical one, and it's to acknowledge that successful use of the light touch regime, it really does require resource capacity and engagement and understanding across different contracting authority departments. I've touched on them a little bit, finance, legal and social works teams. And that's often the biggest hurdle to realising the flexibility within the light touch regime, freeing up that resource and achieving the buy-in and comfort across legal, financial, departmental teams. So theme three, key to successful use is cross-contracting authority engagement and understanding, with a recognition that these carry resource implications. And we've seen this as a message that, don't take it from me, take it from some of the big authorities that have gone through very large and new light touch regime processes. So those themes out the way, I'll turn to the Public Contract Scotland Regulations 2015, being a lawyer, and we'll just take a canter through the key aspects of the light touch regime legal requirements. Thankfully for you, that can only ever be a relatively short exercise, because the regime does that as it is badged and doesn't take up that much space in the regulations. It has its own little part, which is Chapter 3, and within that we have 3 regulations, which are Regulation 74 to 76. Probably the key point that will come across as we go through is that the light touch regime does not engage with the full suite of detailed regulations elsewhere in the Public Contract Scotland Regulations 2015. It does not engage the detailed provisions on negotiated procedure, restricted procedure, open procedure, use of frameworks, dynamic purchasing system. It doesn't engage the full suite of ESPD requirements. And if we go back to formulaic tendencies that I mentioned in the opening, this is something that took a while to digest when it came in. So in law, all the pernickety bits of detail that we tend to agonise over outside the light touch regime have no automatic application within the light touch regime. It's an important point for flexibility. And just to emphasize it by way of example, I remember numerous early conversations on this with contracting authorities saying, the point is you can have a framework within the light touch regime, or even something that's an innovation partnership or competitive procedure with negotiation, but you can dream up how it operates and you can redesign it. You're not constrained by the detailed regulations in these areas. Okay, back to the three regulations, just to take them in turn, just to build the picture of what the light touch regime is, or most likely for most of you, re-emphasize what it is. We have Regulation 74, which is simply noting, look, where you've got a social or other specific service, and they're defined in Schedule 3 of the regulations, this is the procedure you use. You use the light touch regime where it's above threshold, and the current threshold being £663,500. And then it's as simple as that. Regulation 75 just sets out that you need a contract notice or a PIN, again, one that can be used without further competition. And it also just confirms that you need a contract award notice, so nothing shocking or detailed in there. I mentioned earlier that there was some grumbling when, as against the pre-2016 regime, the contract notice requirement came in. But in my view, it actually provides a significant protection in risk terms in this area. And so we see a number of local authorities in particular going out with large multi-million-pound social care light touch regime procurements. There's plenty of examples on PCS with big values, 50 to 100 million. And anyone who doesn't raise an issue at the outset with that scope, that direction of travel for the procurement within the 30 days legally, then starts to limit their options for taking issue with the process, obviously absent specific or direct issues during the process. So just make that point. Okay, so it's then Regulation 76, to the extent that this can be said, that contains the process detail for the light touch regime. You won't find screeds here. You'll find references that don't occur elsewhere in the regulations, for example, to processes being used that are suitable for the specificities of the services or the requirements of users. It's worth touching on 76.2, and this is the main risk hook for us lawyers or yourselves in conducting these procurements in the light touch regime, where a contracting authority requires to ensure equal treatment and transparency. This is, of course, the overarching general requirement that applies to all non-light touch processes as well. And we find it's usually this provision that a contract authority is then wary of in the context of dreaming up or being flexible and trying new approaches. And I'll come back to why the concern on risk here, in my view, is often overstated or overdone. Okay, we then get to Regulation 76.3, and this one focuses on the connection between the SPD or selection considerations. And for light touch, the only formal crossover is the mandatory exclusion grounds in Regulation 58. They're to be covered off when you use the light touch regime. Now, of course, there'll be folk out there that say, well, we've also got the guidance, and that's right. The guidance says that they really want people using the SPD, but the regulations themselves don't state that. And I think what the point of emphasis, what we see in terms of some of the better practice there, is people recognising that in the light touch regime, you can really whittle down what you're using in terms of selective documents, which to make it proportionate to the context it's being used in. And that's something that often comes across from providers in the social care area relevant to administrative burdens and the rest of it. Just carrying on, in terms of requirements, 76.4, we require clear conditions for participation, clear time limits, and clarity on the award procedure. Nothing else stipulated there. And in Regulation 76.5, as with other areas of the regulations, we get the ability to change our process once we've started it, subject to just not crossing over on equal treatment or discrimination in doing that. Again, not very detailed. In Regulation 76.7, a requirement for reasonable timescales, and that's it. None of your day limits that you get in the detailed regulations. The important point is that timings are not prescribed. And again, this is a significant difference and a significant area of flexibility. We then come back to the important point, 72.8. This is what I call the keystone or the blank slate provision. and it confirms that authorities, if they want, they can follow one of the processes that the open, restricted, or whatever they want. They can do it with whatever adaptations to those processes they want, or they can just do whatever form of process they dream up that doesn't look anything like those. And we'll come back to some of the examples where we've seen changes, adaptations to existing processes come out. A couple of final points just worthy of noting. Regulation 72.9 sets out some of the things that can be taken into account in light touch regime processes. We get a specific mention of continuity of service to users, which we don't see in the main regulations, and which really drives in and bears its head in some of the processes that we see. A little bit more about that possibly in discussion. And an ability to focus in on the needs of service users, sort of with a kernel of, look, we can do things a bit differently in this area, bearing in mind the needs of service users. Finally, the best quality price ratio still applies in there, but there's no prescriptive detail, as in the main regulations, on how that breaks down. So that was a brief canter through the detail of the regulations. I had to do that given my billing, but I think the most important parts are, coming back to it, a blank slate. There's no need to follow established processes. There's no 4-year limit on frameworks. That's one that sometimes surprises people. There is no stipulated limit on it. And you have some flexibility with SPD as well. I said I would come back to ensuring why, to explaining why ensuring equal treatment, non-discrimination and transparency should not overly concern anyone. And it's similar to what I mentioned about contracting notices here. Your friend is the 30 days to raise a challenge point for legal challenges. If someone has an issue with the way that you're going about it, they're required to raise it during your process if they're going to take legal issue with it. And the case law in Scotland has recognised that, and well, Boston Scientific is the case on that one. And as I mentioned, there's flexibility to change your process if that comes about. Just have a small drink, a little cough earlier in the week, don't worry, not too serious. Okay, having talked through what the provisions say, I want to say a little bit about what we are seeing in terms of practice. And there's people on this call that will be seeing the same thing, and again, that might be something interesting to bring out in discussion. But some of the big areas, we're seeing minimum process frameworks. These are frameworks which, as discussed, are not covered by the detailed rules on frameworks. They run for longer periods without renewal. The SPD requirements are slimmed down for those going onto them. The numbers on them are often much larger than standard frameworks, with call-off mechanisms bespoke to give flexibility to meet specific objectives around meeting user needs and continuity. So you might get a minimum process framework that's set up to cover all social care requirements in a city, and ends up with hundreds of providers on it, with a mechanism that is almost like, look, we can call off according to user need, and not having any ranking or mechanism in that way. Often, given the blank slate that we talked about, these innovations, we see incorporation of annual refreshes, so that if someone doesn't get on at the first point, they can get on later. And it's quite interesting. I mean, they operate a little bit more like the dynamic purchasing systems for the fresh-faced, or almost like supplier lists for those going back to 1999 or before, who are a bit longer in the tooth. And this is becoming sort of more common under the light touch regime. Again, the light touch dynamic purchasing systems, they're really similar to what I've discussed. Because there's a blank slate, the names don't really mean anything in this area of the light touch regime. And we then have, and I find this area interesting, sort of new multi-stage innovation processes. And we see these being used where a contracting authority in social care is keen to trial new ways of working, not precisely sure where it's all going to land, and it sets out the goal, and it sets out rough stages that will follow the end objective, process timescale. And sometimes these run a little bit like an innovation partnership, or a little bit like a competitive process with negotiation, but with, of course, flexibility to depart from that and not get bogged down in all the detail. And there's some really interesting innovations in that area. sometimes coming out in alliance contracting mechanisms at the end, or sometimes coming out in other forms of collaborative contracting. Very briefly, just before I wind up, it's not light touch regime, but it's worth mentioning in that context, is under the different suite of rules, the Procurement Reform Act 2014 and Section 12 of that, there's the flexibility to directly award social care contracts of 633,500 and below. And some authorities in the social care area choose to use this flexibility. We've seen it with some of the rural authorities, and instead of setting up a big, large, multi-million pound minimum process framework or such like that I've just talked through, that value is enough, gives them enough flexibility to cover off their requirements with different providers and direct award under them. So that's another thing we're seeing in this area. I really, and hopefully leaving a bit of time for us to discuss, I hope that's given you an overview of the lie of the land, some comments, some observations, and hopefully that can generate a little bit of space for some discussion with those of you who are at the coalface here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robin. That's a really, really helpful, I think, overview for us all. And the questions are now starting to flood in. So clearly we have got hopefully got a bit of a discussion. So first of all, there was a question in the chat box, which was a clarification. The question was, the light touch approach can be used above the threshold of 663K. So we're just confirming that that is in fact the case.
It's whichever is the current threshold. I think I had it, unless I had a typo in it, it was 663.5 or 633.5. But yes, the current threshold.
And then the follow-up question to that is, it's guidance below that threshold level. So I think the question is what applies then if it's not the light touch regime below the 663K?
Yep, no problem. That you drop down into the Procurement Reform Scotland Act territory, and you can either, within that, choose to direct award using that Section 12, or you can choose to run a competitive process there if you're within doing it in the procurement terms.
I think that answers your question, Brian. So there's quite a few questions in the chat box which I could now pose to the audience. Does anyone want to put their hand up and ask their question directly? If not, I'll pick a few and start reading them out. Feel free to pop your hand up if you prefer. Okay. I'll go ahead and start reading you some of them then, Robin.
Okay, happy to do it that way.
So, one of the questions is, there are still requirements on advertising. However, please clarify.
Okay, well, let's start with above threshold, light touch regime. Yes, they need to go out with a contract notice, so fully advertised on that front. For the Reform Act regime between 50,000 and the European threshold, then you don't have to advertise if you use Section 12 and direct awardability. That doesn't require advertising. And I think I saw another comment in there in another context about transparency, and it's interesting because when the new regimes came in 2016, there were a lot of questions around that dealt with within the context of the Scottish Government training of, well, how can you not have advertisement and use that direct award for those lower band of contracts and yet still be transparent? And the answer to that is that you are transparent on the fact that you did it by putting in a contract award notice. You're still required to do a contract award notice in those lower valued contracts between 50,000 and the threshold for the light touch regime. And that's where the transparency on it comes in. And just to complete the piece on those lower value ones, at the time we brought it in, I remember a lot of contracting authorities across Scotland saying, we don't think we'll use that direct award flexibility because we're concerned about how we would demonstrate value for money, and we're a little bit worried in that. And what I would say is, just from speaking with people, I've seen a little bit of a migration towards some authorities being far more comfortable and seeing some benefits in using that in certain circumstances.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robin. So one of the questions that my colleague posed to the audience was, do they think that the light touch regime is used enough and should we be using it more? And there's a fair bit of chat now in the box to suggest that we should be, which I think is interesting and potentially helpful going forward. There's a couple more questions for you, Robin. One is a standstill period required for a light touch regime procurement?
Do you know, I was tripping myself up on this yesterday, and I read it one way and thought, oh, maybe it's suggestive there's not. That can't be right. And I read it again, and yes, there is, because what it is you have part 2 of the regulations, and part 2 it also encompasses chapter 3, and chapter 3 being the light touch, and then the requirements on standstill, if I recollect correctly, come in applicable to the whole of part 2. But I did double check myself yesterday.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Perfect. Thank you for confirming. Another question for you. What level of pre-procurement engagement with suppliers is permitted under light touch? For instance, if a provider comes to you with a proposal above the light touch threshold.
Okay, it's really in the same. You're really in the same rule set, but without the prescriptive detail on it. So in the main regs, you've got, give me a bit of latitude, somewhere between Reg 40 and Reg 42, you've got the stuff that covers on ensuring in pre-procurement that you don't go against fairness and transparency. Now, you don't have that prescriptively laid out for light touch regime, but we touched on, you do get in 76.4 or 76.5 the requirement to show equal treatment and non-discrimination, fairness and transparency. So that broad principle applies to you in light touch regime. So you really get to the same place. If someone's coming and speaking to you about a proposed way forward above the threshold, and you're going to go out to procurement on it, then you can have that discussion. That's fine, but don't then generate your procurement to benefit them, go down that route, or have a meeting with providers, do a pre-procurement if you need it. It will depend on the circumstances in there, but it is an area that you still need to watch in the light touch regime because of what I've just said, but you don't have the same prescriptive detail. And there was a case, I think it was 2015, Kenmure or Kenmore Holdings out in the Western Isles that sort of put a shot across everyone's bows around that pre-procurement engagement, which is useful there.
Thanks. Thank you, Robin. That's helpful clarification. So we are technically out of time for the session, but I don't think the conference team will be rushing us to move on because we do have a bit of a break between our next session. So Robin, if you're agreeable, we'll proceed with a couple more questions. If you're okay to hang on, because we do have quite a lot of really interesting chat in the box.
Yep, I'd be happy to do that. I can see one there that looks quite interesting. Can you explain how PSPs and alliance commissioning fits in?
Okay, do you want to pick up that one?
Yeah, in a way, that's what I was alluding to in the last of the examples that I gave of interesting multi-stage processes emerging that have a little bit of the flavour of innovation partnerships or competitive procedures with negotiation. And where we see these is almost a pin or a notice goes out saying, look, we have 50 million of spend, or choose a figure, 10 million of spend in this area. We want to get a really effective delivery of this. We want a really effective collaborative contracting approach at the end. And maybe the authority will choose, and it will choose alliance contracting and then sort of include that form of documentation. And then it will say, look, so what we want interested providers to come forward. This is not under the main regs, so there's latitude. We can see how we do this. We have to ensure basic equal treatment and fairness, but it may be that we see what everyone's got to offer and sort of create the end contracting entities over time. And sorry, it's impossible to put all the little bits and pieces together, but you get moving through from a stage to your sort of final group that take part in the collaboration. And if you like, I made the point that the contract notice at the front end sort of de-risks the process as long as there's a clear enough line of what the stages of the procurement process are going to be, the gateways, the points at which certain people will drop out, and the basis on which you're going to drop them out or move forward. That's only a partial answer, but it's difficult to be absolutely prescriptive on it.
That's great. Thank you, Robin. So there's lots of really interesting chat in the box. There's a couple of questions that I might just pick up briefly in respect to Scotland Excel stuff. So there's a question about what people are doing in relation to adult care homes and whether they're using the light touch regime for those requirements. Certainly at Excel, we've got a national framework for care homes for people with learning disabilities, and that has been procured under the light touch regime and as a flexible arrangement in the way that Robin had described about reopening, allowing people to join. There was also a point in there about needing to use the light touch regime more and looking for a bit of guidance and respect specifically of larger requirements. I think that's a really interesting point, and given that we've obviously got experience of doing national frameworks, that's maybe one for Scotland Excel to go away and take a back and have a think about. And there's a whole bunch more, and we're just not going to get round to them. I do apologise, but if I pose one more question to Robin, I think we'll need to wrap up after that. So Robin, one of the other questions which is quite interesting that's come up is in respect of your comment about frameworks or contracts existing beyond the sort of standard 4-year period. So James asks about the ability to go on longer than 4 years on a flexible basis. That's very interesting. The concern here would be that the specification used originally becomes out of date, for example, as things like the promise or policy changes occur in things that need to be adjusted. Can the light touch regime allow changes to the specification without resulting in material breach and retender?
I think I'll try and answer this in the most helpful way, which is I think that you have significantly more flexibility here, a sort of safer zone to operate in. So, for example, that might turn out that you're in your original procurement documents, you're saying, well, you might not say this, but the logic of it goes, there's no specific time limit. For XYZ reason, we want to have this framework in operation for a longer period. We're comfortable that that fits with our other obligations and considerations and other areas of law, value for money and the rest of it. So bidders should recognise that our requirements may evolve over time, but remain within the scope, remain within these parameters, and that way you can build in that flexibility and tick off the equal treatment transparency because you're stating it up at the front end in the procurement documents. And in a way, it's not different to what we are seeing in the large minimum process frameworks, and there'll be people in these calls. I'll mention some of the names. The Renfrewshire councils have used them. I think or large collaborative procurements like this, you're seeing them in self-directed support. The self-directed support ones are exactly an example of what we're talking about, where because it's self-directed, the specifications within the individual call-offs or little packages of individual call-offs are changing by necessity of the self-directed support legislation all the time. So my broad answer is I can see a way in which you can do what you need to do to cover off your obligations and operate it in that way. Hopefully that was coherent.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks for that. It's a complex area for you to answer so concisely.
But if I could briefly just add a comment to that, which is what I'd be really keen to see is a far better sharing of the practical knowledge on issues just like that, because it has come into being over the last 4 or 5 years. Yes, so people took a little bit of getting used to, but I'm going to shoot down my own logic here. You can now go and speak to the ones that have already done it, and so you can piggyback off their learning if you've not already done it. So I'd be keen to see that knowledge of minimum process frameworks and the like shared.
Absolutely, I think that's a really fair point, and one for us to definitely have a think about how we do some of that better, because clearly there's a lot of good knowledge and experience out there. So I'm afraid to say that we are out of time. I'm afraid we have not quite answered all of the questions, but we will try to impose on Robin's goodwill a bit further and maybe ask for you to have a look at 1 or 2 of these, if you wouldn't mind, Robin, and we can try and get back to the audience separately. I'd like to thank all of you for your questions, and particularly Robin, thank you very much for providing that information and for answering all of that. That's been hugely informative and really enjoyable. So thank you very much for your input, much appreciated.